All right, good morning. Welcome to this one-off wider local studies talk with Abby Hoverstock and Laura Rudham-Centuria of the Denver Public Library. I'm coming to you today from the land of the Gadigal people, whom I acknowledge as the traditional custodians of this land. I pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that to the many Aboriginal countries across Australia where we live and work. And our cross-continental event today is a reminder that First Nations communities around the world have experienced centuries of dispossession and the ongoing impacts of colonisation. I celebrate the history, culture, and ongoing strength of First Nations communities globally, including the Indigenous people of Denver, Colorado. So between 2020 and 2022, Special Collections and Archives staff at the Denver Public Library designed and oversaw a diversity audit of their nearly 6,000 manuscript and photograph collections. Abby Hoverstock, Manager of Archives, and Laura Rudham-Centuria, Archives Access Supervisor, led the process. Audit results highlighted the need for reparative cataloguing to collection descriptions, among other issues. Their team formed a Diversity Audit Action Committee to research, propose, and adopt necessary descriptive changes for a variety of people and communities in their collections. We're going to hear a presentation from Abby and Laura, and then at the end of this, there'll be time for questions. So please use the Q&A function or the chat to ask your questions. And over to Abby and Laura.
Hello, thank you for joining us today for a talk on the Special Collections and Archives Diversity Audit that we undertook at the Denver Public Library's Special Collections and Archives Unit. My name is Laura Rudham-Centuria. I'm the Archives Access Supervisor, and I'm handing off to my colleague Abby here.
And my name is Abby Hoverstock, and I'm the Archives Services Manager in the Special Collections and Archives. Denver Public Library has a Special Collections and Archives that's unusual for public library systems in the United States, and we have over 5,000 manuscript collections that we oversee and take care of. So we're going to talk about the work that we've done in regards to the Special Collections and Diversity Audit. So our division, Special Collections and Archives, is a subdivision within a large urban public library system that has 27 branch locations. We're located in Denver, Colorado, which is right in the center of the American Rocky Mountain West. Our metro area is just under 3 million people, but our population as a city is about 716,000 people in 2025. Our team and our entire staff includes 30 librarians, archivists, and support staff, and our work comprises two distinct repositories, one at the Central Library and one at the Blair Caldwell African American Research Library. So our presentation today will be to share our experience completing a diversity audit of special collections, which began in 2020. And I will begin by talking about how the audit came about and our process of planning and executing the audit. Then I'll hand it back to Laura, who will discuss what we learned in the audit, how we approached remediation of harmful language, and how the project has informed the work that we do since the audit. So how did the project come about in the first place? Well, the year 2020 brought about the crescendo in the United States of the George Floyd murder and the protests that ensued. This event really set a new level of urgency in our country to work differently and to think differently about what we do. And that was certainly the case in our public library environment, thinking about how the murder and protests affected the way that we should think about our collecting. We also had the COVID pandemic happening around the same time, and the library's closure to the public. And after that, some pretty limited hours and services. And that meant that we had we had a moment to pause, to intentionally think about how we could better build an archives for everyone. To do that, we needed to know what our collecting and descriptive deficits were in the first place. We knew we had them, but we really wanted to take this on in earnest. These are the things that the audit clarified for us. So the diversity audit was not just about surveying racial diversity in our collections, but race was one of the important data points that we wanted to explore. So how did our project come about? Our executive leadership team did some comprehensive strategic thinking around the same time. And honoring public trust was named one of our library's core values. Honoring public trust also included actionable values of preserving Denver's history and being good stewards of library collections. These values speak directly to the work that we do in special collections. It was important and helpful for us to ground the work we would do creating a diversity audit of special collections in a framework that was supported by the highest level of our organization. By having the strategic backing of the library, we could ensure that the various steps involved in a diversity audit, including the remediation work that follows, will be supported by the library in the coming months and years, and it ensured that our work would not be abandoned. So as a public institution, our library users are a varied group. DPL customers come from a wide-ranging backgrounds and have a wide range of library skills and lived experiences and backgrounds in doing archival research. We strive to be a local and regional collection with something for everyone. So first, we identified some goals for the audit. We formed some basic questions we hoped the audit could answer for us. We wondered, what do our collections look like as a whole? What stories do they tell? Who is currently documented in our collections and who is omitted? How do we describe the people in our collections? And what can we do as archivists to improve our collections and descriptions right now? The basic questions we started with led to drafting more clear intentions for the project. What are we doing, why, and how are we doing it? A diversity audit would help us understand more about who our collections are created by and who they are about. The information we learn, we hoped, would guide us in future collecting, making decisions about digitization and cataloging efforts. Why are we doing it? Because our description does not always capture the information that library users are seeking. Sometimes it's hard to find information about race or gender identity or disability or the languages that our collections comprise and more. How would we do our project? Well, we decided we would involve staff from across the library to become auditors. And we would create an easy to follow process, clear documentation, and use tools that were available to everyone. Our high-level summary and methodology is this. We pitched the project first to the leadership team, to library supervisors system-wide, and we shared regular updates throughout our whole process with our staff. Our audit took 5 months of planning and drafting and 15 months of actual auditing every collection. We were able to mobilize staff from across the system remotely. During the COVID work from home era, we had an opportunity to bring in coworkers whose work didn't lend itself very well to online work from home. So we were able to bring folks in from other parts of our library system to help work on this project. And we typically had their support from their supervisors as well. As a group, we audited 5,903 collections using catalog and archive space records, archive space being our content management system. And we used tools from the Google Suite. We were able to review data points for all our special collections without actually opening a physical box. So what did we want to learn? As we got to drafting actual questions for the audit, we had to land on just the questions we felt would be the most valuable to us. We explored which questions could be answered by analyzing keyword search results alone, and which ones needed humans in order to synthesize the information. We identified this list. We specifically wanted to know the geographic locations of our collections, the racial identities of the people involved in our collections. We wanted to know more about gender and sex identities and sexual orientations. We were curious about mental health and disability in our collections. We wondered about religions, the time frames that our collections were created, and the languages of our material. As we designed it, the diversity audit was indeed a project that required human interaction. We needed human power to find the more complex answers we had about our collections. But I do wonder now if there are parts of our audit that could be surveyed using artificial intelligence now or in the near future. However, as Laura will point out later, the human element proved to be critical in the task of remediating harmful language. Some initial project snapshots. What we knew going into the audit included, we knew that we had some historical collecting patterns in our archives. We knew that most of our collections were about powerful and influential people, and those people tend to be in our culture more white, more male, more cisgender, more heterosexual. We knew that we had very few Native American collections and collections created by Indigenous people. And those that we have probably have questionable accuracy in some of our terminology. There are trust issues with libraries. And so that was not a surprise to us. We figured that we probably would not have many Native American collections. We also knew that our collections weren't just 19th century Old West collections. That tends to be a stereotype of the American West, that people think if we've got local history collections in Colorado, it's probably cowboy collections. And we knew that wasn't true. But some things that we hadn't considered before the audit was just how white and male our collections actually were. That it was hard to define those collections because they seem to be the default collections. Those characteristics are typically not even noted in our metadata. For instance, if we have a collection by a first female legislator or African American or Black men, they would be described as such. But if those collections are about men, they would probably just be called legislator or a group of men. And the default would be that they would be white. We also knew that we learned that our descriptions make it hard to identify disability in our collections. Where do you even find mental and physical disability descriptors in historic metadata? And we also were surprised that all sorts of collection management challenges would pop up as a result of doing a diversity audit. So here are some examples of some questions that we actually formulated for the audit itself. We spent a considerable amount of time designing the form. Here's our dates question. Understanding the date ranges of our collection seemed like an easy proposition at first, but when we considered how the data would be presented in the end, we realized we might like to see the concentration of collections over smaller units of time. So we chose decades. The beginning part of this list is centuries, but mostly decades. Auditors were to select all the decades that applied to the coverage of a collection. Later in the presentation, you'll see how this data presented in a nice, easy to understand bar graph. This collection, or this question rather, was about the racial identities represented. We made a list of identities that we felt could plausibly be in our collection, knowing it wasn't complete. But we allowed for multiple choices since many collections contain mention of multiple identities. The screenshot of a catalog record that you see here guided the auditors to look for mentions of racial identities in the free text biographical field, but also in the subject heading fields. We provided a selection for racial identity not listed also, which proved to be a common choice in our audit. And we'll say more about that data point later. We gave some thought to creating the not exhaustive list of names of Native American and Indigenous tribes by surveying tribal websites to determine preferred terminology and connecting with colleagues, our own coworkers with lived experiences to ensure that we used appropriate terminologies. However, some of the terms that have long existed in our catalog are incorrect or offensive. So we had to pair the outdated terminology with the correct terminology, since we knew that those terms would come up in the metadata and we wanted to make sure our auditors could identify them. So now I'm going to turn it over to Laura, who will discuss a little bit more about how we proceeded once the audit was complete and what projects the audit has inspired in the last few years.
Okay, thank you, Abby. Okay, so this is what our end data project, our results looked like after 15 months of auditing. We basically had a massive spreadsheet of data. We had 5,903 results with at least 18 answers each. But as you'll see, some of our free text fields meant that we got more than the 18 questions that we got more than 18 questions answered. There was some really helpful information, really interesting information in the data, but also a lot of incidental data. So things like people's careers, funny but irrelevant details from the biographical notes. Again, useful, interesting information, not so useful from the diversity audit perspective. We also discovered, as Abby mentioned, some collection management issues. We had inconsistencies in collection titles, sometimes between our catalog and archive space. We might have, in some instances, collections in one database, but not in the other. These had nothing to do with the audit's goals per se, but that was useful information that is actionable later. We also found some cataloging errors, typos, date spans that were sometimes inconsistent. And then overall, we found that there were some things that we wished that we had asked differently in order to get better answers. And I'll mention one of those in a little bit. Okay, so this is one example of one of our questions. This was the dates question. And one of the things that we learned from this collection was that, contrary to popular belief, we're not a 19th century Old West collection. Our 20th century collections were actually quite strong. And as you'll note, the strongest decade for our coverage is actually the 1940s. And this was largely due to our 10th Mountain Division records, which document the experience of World War II ski troops who trained in Colorado and then fought in the Italian Alps. We hadn't considered how strongly those collections would point towards this particular decade. It seems obvious in hindsight, but this really helped us understand a little bit more about our collection strength. Looking at our demographic question results overall, we found that many of the results looked very similar to this one, where identity not listed was actually the largest category or the largest result. And first you look at this and you think, what in the world is going on here? But as Abby previously mentioned, the history of cataloging in our country is the primary explanation for what's going on with this particular question. So, historically, if a person who's represented in a collection fit into that sort of default identity that I don't think was necessarily established as a default, I think it was indicative of just people's mindsets. But that identity being white, male, cisgendered, heterosexual, Christian, etc., those perceived default identities weren't necessarily called out in our records, but any identity that departs from that category would be. So hence we don't have descriptions that would say something like Mr. Jones was a Caucasian banker who lived in Denver, whereas we would definitely see Mr. Jones was an African-American banker who lived in Denver. So this of course meant that our data was more significant in its absence for many of our questions. You can see here that for race, more than 5,000 of our collections show that no information is available, and we assume these collections are related to white folks, but we can't say with 100% certainty as there's a couple of other potential explanations. But as we were looking at this, we realized that we're more interested in knowing about the communities for which we actually do have some data here, and so the audit still provided useful information for us. You'll recall I mentioned wishing we had phrased certain questions a little bit better. The free text questions were one of these instances. When we began the audit, one of our strategy and assessment folks recommended that we steer clear of free text fields. We ignored her, which was both a mistake, but also our best idea from the whole audit. And this geographic question illustrates the mistake part of that nicely. We asked where the collection was based, and we got towns, counties, states, geographic regions, countries, and continents. And obviously, most of those are overlapping. It's a big mess that we've decided to ignore for now below the state level. And we might take a stab at using AI to help it in the future, but I think that's a project down the road. But I also, in addition to mentioning the mistake part of the free text field, I also mentioned that it was the best idea from the whole audit. And this was because we asked one open-ended question that was about offensive or outdated language in the records. And that question gave us a wealth of actionable data that we're now using in our reparative cataloging efforts. We'll get to what the reparative cataloging looks like in a minute. But first, I wanted to share a few top-level takeaways from the audit itself. So these were excuse me, some of our top level takeaways from the audit. And I want to specifically point out a couple of them here. One was that certain communities were nearly entirely missing from our collections. We're now working to build relationships with community organizations from some of these groups. And thus far, we've been able to bring in a couple of new collections based on this work. But as we all know, these efforts can take many years before they show significant fruit. And then the other piece was regarding the question asking for offensive or outdated language. We received more than 200 responses that highlighted harmful language or that pointed out records that talk about people from an anthropological angle. And by this, I mean language that's tinged with sometimes vague disrespect. It's not necessarily a negative term, but there's something about it that doesn't quite sit with you. Or language that talks about people in an othering way or in minoritizing ways. So looking at our harmful language examples, we decided we needed to form a diversity audit action committee to do reparative cataloging. The lack of clearly offensive terms meant we weren't just trading out a bad word for an acceptable one, but that we would need to do close inspection and rewriting of many of our biographical notes. So we decided to form a diversity audit action committee. Our committee consisted of archivists, librarians, catalogers, and metadata experts. And we have folks from a variety of different demographic identities on the team as well. We later created smaller task forces to address specific issues. The action part of the title was important to us to remind us that there need to be observable goals and achievements from this project. This isn't a navel gazing exercise, but is something that's meant to have achievable ends. So step one for the committee was that we created a Google Drive folder of helpful articles and tools for DEI-informed archival and cataloging practice. These included things like the Homosaurus, which, if you're not familiar with it, is an international linked data project that supports access to LGBTQ collections. Another great example of a resource that we used was the Archives for Black Lives in Philadelphia Anti-Racist Description Resources Report, which is really helpful for resetting how we think about describing communities to which we ourselves may not belong. So after we've done some of our initial research, we grouped our audit results by the themes that we were seeing in the collections, which you see here. The blue themes are the ones that we've addressed so far, and I'll talk a little bit about the Mrs. No First Name issue on the next slide. So anyone who's ever formed a committee knows that there are challenges working with committees, getting them set up. And and just in general setting up your workflows. So I'll share some of our challenges with you here, but also feel free to ask us during the Q&A or to email us afterwards if you have follow-up questions. One of our questions was about committee formation, like how many cooks is too many? Do we have the right folks on the team? We did have some feelings when we first started out. We had assumed we were all on the same page about the goals and methods of the project, but we had one cataloger who hesitated to make significant changes to long-standing catalog records based on newer social movements. I think we could have benefited from more upfront conversations and planning before we jumped in. A big challenge was workflows. You know, with so much to do, where do you start? And that brings up the Mrs. No First Name issue that I referenced on the previous slide. We were looking at collection descriptions where women were identified entirely by their spouse's name. So Mrs. John Jones, for example. And to catch these, we pulled a catalog report of every collection that we had with the word Mrs. in it. And then we needed to research who these women were in order to discover their first names so that we could add them into their subject headings. That was a lot of work, in addition to the workflows of who will update the catalog, who will update archive space, how do we make sure those two databases match, etc. And overall, from this particular issue, we learned that we should just focus on the specific collections that were identified in the audit, even knowing that those same issues will be in other records that may not have been flagged throughout the collection. And then we formed smaller task forces to focus on each theme. And so while we know other collection records contain some of these same problems, searching out additional instances for correction will become part of our future general operations for the cataloging team. And then finally, the harmful language statement. Some of our team worked closely with the library's larger general technical services department and our marketing folks to come up with a harmful language statement that will be used across the whole system. So after having shared a few of the lessons we learned through the audit, I'll wrap up the overall project with some summary points. We're really glad that we undertook this project. We have a much better understanding of our collections now, and this list is some of our takeaways for anyone else who's considering a similar audit. And in the interest of time, I'll just talk about a couple of them. But first, we can't state enough how important it was to the success of our project that we had support from our administration and that we had colleagues who were invested in the work. Another important point is you want to make sure you're front loading all of the thinking forming your questions and ask yourself repeatedly, why do we want to know this particular thing? Is it actionable? How should we craft the question to get the kind of response we're looking for? Another thing we learned is that you should reward your contributors. We raffled gift cards on a monthly basis to encourage folks who are hitting certain auditing milestones, and that really sometimes drove some of the contributions. We had 47 different auditors from across the system who contributed to our audit, and a number of them were rewarded with gift cards. But then we also rewarded their curiosity. A few months after the project ended, we started getting questions about what we had found, and we realized that the staff were really wanting to know, you know, what is in the collection, what did my work contribute to? So we did a staff presentation to share out much of our data, our conclusions, and our next steps. And that last part, the next steps, was very important to a lot of our contributors. And then finally, this work is never done. We definitely learned that. Even if we were able to capture and change every single concerning issue in every record over the next few years, we know that language and society change over time, and the way that we talk about people should evolve and be reevaluated in our records as well. Once our action committee work addressing the 200 specific issues that we found is done, our cataloging folks will be using our diversity audit cataloging manual to inform DEI work going forward, and they'll be looking for those instances on a broader scale. So overall, if you plan to implement a project like this, we think it's important to be humble and to be patient, but also to be brave and to dive in and you know, tackle the project. Overall, your community and your collections will be better for it. So that really sums up the bulk of our diversity audit and our next steps. We'll be opening to questions following this presentation. Please feel welcome to email Abby or myself. Our emails are here if you have any further questions. And we thank you for your interest and your time.
Hey, thank you so much, Laura and Abby. I think there's so much value in what you've presented in our local studies collections. In Australia, we deal with the same issues of collection biases and missing voices. And so I think that there'll be a lot of enthusiasm for libraries here doing a similar project. So we've got a few questions to get through. The first one is really a two-part question, and it's looking at everything that's happened since this audit. So how have your collecting practices changed? And as a result, how does the collection look now a few years later? And those are big questions, so take as long as you need. But I notice you have a third panelist there. So as you get into the question, if you want to introduce your colleague.
Sure, Stu. So when we initially began the audit, Abby and I were sort of leading the charge, but we are both on the archives team. And as we were working through the different task forces, we realized that particularly as our work is going to be operationalized going forward, our cataloging team would be taking over a lot of the responsibility for that. So we have added our team member, Katie McKendrick here, who is our cataloging supervisor as well. Hello, everybody.
I can speak to a couple of the questions. I think the big question is, what does a diversity audit of special collections do for your collecting future? And I think, you know, our aspirations are really big there. We really want to make change quickly. We want to find the gaps in our collection and we want to fill them. And I think a lesson learned 3 years later is that, of course, collecting growth and change takes a lot of time. It's just a reminder that collecting for archival collections, primary sources, collecting for the future is a really long game. And libraries have a lot of trust building to do with communities that have had good reason not to trust the library in the past. And those kinds of things don't change overnight. We know this, but it's a process like this is a reminder of the fact that every interaction, every relationship we build is impactful and matters over time. And some of that work is going to take a long time, a really long time to improve. However, one thing that I think the diversity audit has been helpful for is at least providing data and some gauge against which we can compare collections we're being offered to collections we already have. Just a data-driven model to kind of feel confident in some of the choices that we make when we're often approached by donors or prospective donors, and we spend a lot of our time actually trying to, you know, just keep up with the influx of people that would like to have their collections in the institution. So feeling confident that we can sometimes say no because we know we've got X number of collections that kind of already do what your collection that you're offering is trying to do. Doesn't mean your collection's not historically valuable or important. It just might not be the best use of our people, time, and the best stewardship of the library for us to accept something. So I think it's given us some confidence there.
I think too, one of the things that we noticed from our audit was that we had very, very few collections that were related to the Asian American and the Asian communities in our area. And so we had one staff member who was very engaged and engaging in doing outreach. And so she was going to some of the different festivals around town that the library itself normally sends an outreach team to, but our department hadn't prior to that. And she went and built some community organization relationships and came up with an idea for a community contributed cookbook that was specifically looking at Asians and Southeast Asian and Pacific Islander, I believe, collections. And so we actually ended up publishing this community cookbook that had come about through that. So then that cookbook is in our collection and those people's stories and their recipes. But then also that built relationships with some community groups. And so we've had this, as Abby was mentioning, sort of iterative relationship where we do a showcase for a particular group and we show them some of the collection that has come through some of this relationship. And so it's it's baby steps a little bit, but it's allowed us to be very intentional about how we do that. So.
And as you say, it's an ongoing process, and it's something you need to keep building on. So that's really positive. Katie, from a cataloging perspective, is there anything that you've kind of embedded into your procedures now in terms of what you're doing?
Yeah, so I would say that on a very general level, we realized that there was a need to add some more specific harmful language statements. I think Laura mentioned in her presentation that the library as a whole came out with sort of a blanket harmful language statement, but it's not the easiest to find on our website. And so we sort of came up with the idea of creating specific notes that would be present in the record, both in our public catalog and then in the archive space finding aid. So if you'll forgive the cataloger nerd speak for a minute, we decided to implement, so if there's harmful language in the title, we would add a 245, just formatted as usual, and then a subfield I for, title transcribed from item. And then if it's sort of a general harmful content warning, like the harmful content is spread throughout the item or somewhere within the content, we would do a 500 note indicating that there was harmful content, and then specifying the type of harmful content and just making a note about, how this reflects kind of the views of the creator and the society in which they were operating at the time. And then finally, we would also add another 500 note if it was a geographic place name that was harmful, which came up quite a bit in the diversity audit. So just another note about how, the title is, this specific type of harmful language, if it's a geographic place name in the title or a caption or just somewhere in the content, and then noting that places were named within, again, the context of the society in which people were living. I do feel like that was helpful for folks just to know that, like, hey, these names were not on the cataloging team or on the archives team in their descriptions. It's just what's transcribed from the item. So I think kind of noting that distinction we realized was important, especially after conducting this diversity audit. But, there's a few different, subject headings or descriptive practices that we've started implementing. Laura mentioned homosaurus in the presentation. So DPL as a whole has started implementing homosaurus subject headings since then, which I think are, more nuanced and more updated than the Library of Congress subject headings that we generally use for our collections. And then I'll note one other added subject heading in particular that we've been using for our Japanese American World War II collections, which is to note that these were not internment camps, they're concentration camps. So we've been referring to them as American concentration camps. And then also putting in a subject heading referring to concentration camps within this period in the United States. So that's, I could go on, but those are some of the more major changes that we've been making, not only for these collections, but in our cataloging practices as a whole.
That's great. You're definitely in a safe space with the cataloger nerd speak, so keep it coming. We actually had a question about those harmful language statements, whether it would be something that you could share with us. And if you don't have them handy right now, you could maybe give to Ellen and we could add them to our wiki and share them with our network.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I do want to address, because this came up in our last presentation, someone asked why it was a general 500 note and not I think it was a 546, but our integrated library system connected to our public catalog doesn't play nicely with the the indicators that generate display constants. So it would have just come up as a note anyway. So that's why we do 500 fields, but you all might have a little bit more room to play around with the more specific 5XX fields. So there I go again with the cataloger nerd speak. So. But yeah, I'm more than happy to share the specific text with everybody.
Oh, that would be really helpful for us.
Yeah.
So just as a reminder to everyone tuning in, please continue to put your questions into chat or use the Q&A feature. I've got another question, which is about how you've communicated the audit and potentially everything you've done since to your community, and what's the response been like?
Sure, that exhibit in here. Yeah. So we initially didn't communicate a lot of it because we were really like in the trenches doing the work, I guess. But as we've gotten further out from it, we've been doing more of that. So Abby and I together wrote an article for Public Libraries Magazine, the Public Library Association's publication, that talks about the work that we did very initially. We had also an exhibit this last year that was talking about what staff did behind the scenes while the library was closed during the COVID closure. And our COVID closure was longer than everyone else's to a certain degree because we had a building construction project that was tacked on to the COVID closure as well. So we actually had quite an amount of time that we were getting to do behind the scenes work that we don't have as much time for usually. But so we did an exhibit on the audit and what we had found and shared that with the community. I think as far as very public announcements, we haven't, trumpeted things out to, I think, the larger non-library, non-archival community. We've done some presentations for different archival groups as well. And part of that is, I think, part of the not broadcasting it from the rooftops is that it is sort of a strange topic for non-professional library and archives communities, that you have to explain so much from the beginning that you slowly lose it or quickly lose interest, I guess. But I think some of it too is we are really committed to doing the work, but we're also aware of the political environment that we're currently in this country. And so we're wanting to do the work, share it publicly with the immediate audiences that are interested in it. But we'd like to be able to continue to do that. So, and the library has indicated that we're committed to continuing this work as well. And we had mentioned that, Abby mentioned that at the beginning of the presentation, that having that support from our administrators really sort of drove everything, because at any point when we're making a decision, we know, okay, we can just do this because we're supported in it. So do you have anything to add?
No, I think that's good. I also think, sometimes when we're doing a big project like that, we don't often stop to think about share outs to the public. We don't do enough of that. I think Laura talked about the complicated moment that we're in, wanting to share our good work and not wanting to create any firestorm. I would say one of the great outcomes of this project has been to internally communicate our own best practices by documenting. And I'm going to hold up the cataloging team again, because it was the catalogers on our Diversity Audit Action Committee who began compiling in earnest the preferred language and institutional best practice that we were adopting while we were adopting it into what has become an institutional best practice manual. So to be able to have catalogers and archivists communicating on common language that we agree on going forward is a real benefit to your team, both now and in the future, and something that we could share with other professionals who are interested too. I think that's been one of the great outcomes of this project. Metadata is something we all deal with, but having that teamwork approach is laying some really solid groundwork for us to improve our metadata going forward and not forget what we've learned.
Yeah, that's great. What about the other side of the equation? any ongoing challenges? You mentioned the political situation, but is there anything from the project that you're really still grappling with and haven't, you know, found a solution for, or you're still working on?
I have one. We're the next topic that we're going to tackle, we were calling language of colonization. And that is a much more fuzzy one because it's often putting yourself in the shoes of the person being described and thinking, would they have described themselves this way? Like, what sort of bias are we approaching to the existing description? So some of them will be very easy. We have a lot of descriptions that say things like first baby born in Denver. Well, they were born in 1860. They were probably not the first baby born in Denver. They were the first white baby that was recorded that was born in Denver. So those are, I think, easier to change. But I think some of the other language of colonization is going to just require a lot of thinking and stepping out of ourselves, basically. Was that the one you were gonna? Yeah.
No, but that's a good one. I was gonna say, I think scope creep is still a little bit of a factor, even though we decided, you know, not at the beginning, unfortunately, but some of the way through that I think it was probably halfway through our second or third focus area that we should just focus on what we found in the audit, because our catalog has many, many mistakes and many instances of harmful language, and it's impossible to fix it all in a reasonable amount of time. And, you know, that's something that like I definitely struggle with as somebody who catalogs. I'm like, no, this has to be perfect. But I feel like just if we keep reiterating that, like, hey, we're just going to focus on this subset of records, I think that will help moving forward. And then another one I was going to say is just people's schedules, because we have a lot of people who are interested in working on our action committee, but it's tough to coordinate, you know, 9 people's schedules to have regular meetings and analyze things together. So, I mean, that's kind of a basic answer, but I feel like that's been more of a challenge now that everybody's kind of back to work and back into things. So
I thought of another one as well. We didn't look at our digital collection database for any of this. Largely
whole other,
yeah.
yeah.
Other can of worms. You know, because we're describing things at an item level in that database, and there's some very messy things in there. And so at the time when we were making that decision, we thought we just want to start doing something concrete. And so we'll stick to the catalogs that are easier to manage. So the archive space and our regular catalog. And we thought, we'll think about the digital collection down the road. And at some point we'll have to do that, but maybe we won't be here.
We'll have our cataloging manual to guide us.
So, but yeah, so that's a big hairy thing that we'll have to look at some point in the future.
And I guess once you do start looking into things, you realize just how much work you still have to do.
Yeah, again, scope creep. It's tough.
Now we have a question here that I think has a lot of potential for nerding out. So I'll just ask it. Firstly, Emma says, "Thank you so much, fantastic work. How do you deal with different standards for databases and database structures between published and archival metadata? And when making general rules or changes to records, do you end up with different strategies because of that?"
Ooh, that is a good question. So I'll say we have slightly different standards for our public catalog records versus our archive space records, because we have kind of more room. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, archivists, but in archive space, I would say we tend to be more descriptive and have more text in there because there's room for that, and it's a little bit more like the user interface is more pleasant, for lack of a better word. And so I would say, to me, it seems like that's where like the archivist who is processing and describing the collection can kind of go within reason, go all out with information about the subjects of the collections, whereas in a public catalog, you know, it's less pleasant to look at. And so we have to kind of pare down that text a little bit more. And then we kind of have to manually put in a link to archive space from the public catalog. So that's like a kind of a separate thing to put in. And any linked data that's in the public catalog record will only go to other entries in the public catalog in terms of like subject headings or like creator names. That will only go to other similar entries in the public catalog, 856s and external links notwithstanding. And then same with archive space, like it has its agent links and kind of its own system for doing that. So we have to be really careful to make sure that the same types of links are in both systems. But I would say in terms of like subject headings and agent links, we just try to put the same things in both so that we're consistent with that. And then just try to use the same types of descriptive language in both, even though in archive space, we can be a little bit more descriptive. I said that a lot.
Well, and I would say functionally, we also have the same cataloging team doing the cataloging in both our content management system and archives and the MARC records in our ILS. So by having, I'm not sure if it's that way everywhere, but having the same person with the mindset is a good approach for consistency.
Yeah, for sure. That would help.
And we're mindful of anytime we're updating something in a collection for any reason in one place, we are always mindful of, okay, now that I've updated it in archive space, I need to either get it updated myself in our catalog or talk to one of the catalogers about it. So we're always making sure they mirror each other.
Okay, we've got a few minutes left. If anyone wants to get some last minute questions in, I'd like to ask, you mentioned the cookbook, which is a great outcome. Have you got any other like ongoing collection projects or even a dream project that you'd like to see take place?
Not at the moment. I know our person who is heading up the cookbook project would love to do another one, perhaps with the same community or perhaps with another community. But we wrapped that one up, I guess last year, and then have had some continued community programming and collecting conversations that have happened since then. So it is, as Abby said, I can tend to, you know, we are working on the planting seeds time right now and then hoping for harvesting perhaps years or decades down the road. But.
Yeah, and I will say one innovation that I forgot to mention earlier when you asked about how cataloging standards have evolved because of this, is this wasn't directly as a result of the diversity audit, but we just went through a record enhancement process through Backstage, which is a company that kind of remotely will do all of that for us and look at our authorities, make sure they're okay. And we asked them to implement an Indigenous vocabulary that was more inclusive than the one from the Library of Congress, and included a lot more tribal names that were preferred by their respective communities. So I'm really excited about that, and that's really cool. And so I'm excited if we get some collections about Indigenous folks, local Native American communities, we can implement some of those, and people will kind of see that in those collections and see themselves in that. So,
and building on what Katie said, we, despite the fact that some of our most challenging problems, I think, were related to our Indigenous collections, there's a conversation in American libraries right now about, well, how do you handle relations with different tribes, because obviously each one is a different community. And you really need to be talking to those communities on an individual basis. And then what are the preferred terms for each community? And so there are a couple of organizations that are working on sort of guidelines for a lot of libraries. And we thought, instead of trying to awkwardly invent the wheel on our own, that we would wait until those communities had more information to share with everyone, and then we would implement sort of best practices at that point. So we've been intentionally leaving those records towards the end so that we are able to do a better job with them.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions come in. So thank you for taking the time to talk with us. Could you tell us a little more about what information was available about the archives to the auditors? If they didn't open the boxes, were they relying solely on catalogue records or contents lists? And how detailed is this information?
So they were beginning with the regular collection level catalog record in our ILS. We are fortunate enough that every one of our archival collections had a collection level catalog record. So that may not be the case in a lot of institutions. That was the beginning place. From the MARC record, you could link to a descriptive finding aid in archive space that may or may not have been fully fleshed out with container listing. Most of them were by the time we launched this project, but sometimes you would encounter a rather empty archive space record when you got there, or one that would say nothing more than what the catalog record, the MARC record, already told you. So we took those two things into consideration, and just knowing that we had something, we opted to point people in those those two places and ask them to assess the records from an auditor's perspective, given just that. And so our questions were also written with that in mind, and didn't attempt to go too much deeper in the sense that they should have been able to answer the basic questions in the audit questionnaire based on that information. It's a great question, and that would be so different for every institution. You'd have to really figure out how you're going to approach that. One suggestion would be to give staff who had access to deeper finding aids or inventories that might not be widely accessible, give them those hard ones, and then share the collections with a larger audience that were available in a simpler, more straightforward way.
Okay, well, thank you so much. That gets us just about to the end of our time. As I said earlier, I think there's so much potential for this in our public libraries in Australia, and we really appreciate you sharing your insights, your experience, your expertise. So as Ellen says, we've got a lot to think about here. So hopefully for everyone tuning in, we can start seeing some diversity audits from Australian public libraries. But thank you all so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for your interest. We appreciate all of you. Thank you.